Welcome. My name is Peter Knox. I am the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, but this evening we're all here for my colleague, my friend Jenifer Neils, who is the recipient this year of the first Baker Nord Center Award for Distinguished Scholarship in the Humanities, and she will be presenting to us a talk on the Sauroktonos, the lizard slayer in English, from Praxiteles to Charles Ray. Charles Ray is entirely new to me. I wanted to introduce first the Dean of the College, Cyrus Taylor, who will make some remarks.
Thank you very much, Peter. It is actually a real privilege to be here to honor Jenifer Neils, the LCB Smith Professor in the Liberal Arts, and as Peter noted, the first recipient of the Baker Nord Center Award for Distinguished Scholarship in the Humanities. Peter will speak more directly about Jenifer's towering role in the discipline of classical studies, but I wanted to take just a minute or two to talk about the profound impact that she's had on Case Western Reserve University during her career. She arrived in Cleveland in 1980, initially holding a dual position as a professor in the Department of Art History and Art and as assistant curator in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Now in her 37th year as a member of the faculty, she's been a leader and innovator in essentially every possible way. She chaired the Department of Art History and Art for 12 years. One of the most important things that in the life of a university are the faculty, and she's served or chaired on more than 20 faculty search committees, so that she's had a profound impact on who is here and leading the university forward. The connection with the Cleveland Museum of Art, which was manifest from her very first appointment here, is of course deeply important to both institutions in the form of the joint program in art history between us and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Jenifer has overseen that and played a role on the various committees throughout her career, and I think it's fair to say has done an extraordinary amount to shape this truly extraordinary program that I think is one of the gems of the two institutions and of Cleveland. She's a gifted fundraiser, and for the Department of Art History, basically took the lead in raising the funds for the two endowed lectureships, the Julius Fund and the Buchanan Lecture Series. Beyond the department and the connections with the museum, Jenifer has probably served on every major committee in the College of Arts and Sciences, or its predecessors, and probably most of them at the university level as well. Beyond that, in her work, her scholarship, her general approach to what it means to be an academic, she sets a level of excellence that I think we all aspire to and few of us can hope to reach. For the past 5 years, Jenifer has spent half her time as chair of the managing committee of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, this country's oldest overseas research center. And now, it is bittersweet for me to note that this is her final year as a member of the CWRU faculty. For next year, she takes on the role of director of the American School of Classical Studies, and indeed is the first woman director in the 135-year history of the institution. I'm truly proud to have had an opportunity to work with Jenifer. I count her as a friend, and I'm thrilled to be part of honoring her here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Taylor. As some of you know, I'm now coming up on the end of my second year here as director of the Baker Nord Center. It's been an incredible pleasure and privilege for me to work with the colleagues in the humanities departments that are affiliated with the center. There are so many talented and distinguished scholars and teachers among them. Life here is truly an intellectual joy. It was partly in order to recognize the extraordinary array of talents that we have in the faculty here in the humanities that we instituted at the Baker Nord Center this past year, this new award for distinguished scholarship in the humanities. And I could not have been more thrilled when our committee recommended that the first award in this series would go to my colleague, Jenifer Neils. As a member of the Classics Department, she has been my colleague, she's become my friend, and has always been a scholar I have admired. Let me highlight just some of Jenifer's accomplishments over the arc of her distinguished career, detailing just a few of the reasons why she is widely regarded as one of the very small number of scholars of ancient art and culture who rank at the top of the field. Jenifer has authored or edited 13 books on subjects of central importance to her discipline and has contributed more than 70 articles or book chapters to the most prestigious publications in ancient art and archaeology. This does not include her countless book reviews, contributions to catalogs, papers presented at scholarly conferences, electronic media, or public lectures. Nor does it take into account her work on several major excavations, including her long-standing and continuing participation on the important site of Morgantina in Sicily. Distinction in research in the humanities is not typically characterized by a single breakthrough discovery, but by a body of work that has a sustained impact upon the discipline. In Jenifer's case, this is demonstrated in the wide range of her publications over the course of a long career, which forms the backdrop to one of her most important contributions to scholarship. It is not easy to say something that is both new and true about the most important landmarks in our culture, but that Jenifer has done, especially in her recent publications on the Parthenon frieze, an icon of Mediterranean civilization that has been the subject of study for centuries. In her book on the Parthenon frieze, for example, published by Cambridge University Press in 2001, Jenifer deftly demolishes prevailing explanations of the iconography of the frieze, offering a new interpretation which is characterized by her usual attention to the cultural context and details in the execution of the carving. Drawing on her unrivaled mastery of the data from inscriptions and the iconography of Greek vase painting, she locates the subject matter of the frieze within the context of Periclean Athens as a theoxenia, a festival in honor of the gods, celebrating the city's victories on land and sea. Jenifer presents her results in a style that at once meets the highest standards of scholarship and yet remains accessible to non-specialists, and I am certainly looking forward to hearing her on the subject of the celebrated sculpture behind me. Jenifer will, as Dean Taylor noted, be leaving us to become the first woman to serve as director of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens in its 135-year history. I hope they're ready for her. This is both a happy event, but it is tinged with some sadness at the prospect of losing a distinguished colleague. Let's lighten the moment then by applauding her accomplishments as Dean Taylor and I present her with this plaque commemorating the Baker Nord Center's first award for distinguished scholarship in the humanities.
On the first day of the month in Greece, they say Kalomina. And since today is February 1st, I wish you all a Kalomina. Thank you for those generous remarks, both from the Dean and the Director of the Baker Nord Center. I have enjoyed 37 years of teaching and research and administration at this great university, and I'm very indebted to all the deans I've worked with and my fellow faculty, any one of whom in the humanities is deserving of this award, and I hope to see many of them receiving it in the future. And I thank the Baker Nord Center and its director in particular for dreaming this up and giving it to me for the first round. This lecture, it's like my swan song, like my farewell lecture. It brings me back around to the beginning of my career when I started at the Cleveland Museum of Art as a very young scholar, not knowing much about museum work, but I learned a lot along the way, and I've always enjoyed, and as have our students, the proximity of this fabulous museum right across the street. I will sorely miss having a great museum. They do have good museums in Athens, to be true, full of Greek sculpture and other arts, but the museum has always been an inspiration to us and our students, and it always will be. So today I'm going to talk about an object, present my point of view on an object which is not usually considered controversial in the history of art. I think after this lecture you might consider it rather controversial. So I will launch right into it. The Apollo, known as the Sauroktonos, or lizard slayer, is one of the icons of classical art history. Long considered a major work of the 4th century Athenian sculptor Praxiteles, and known from numerous Roman copies, gems, and coins, some of which you see here. It represents one of two unquestioned attributions. The other one is Myron's Discobolus, the discus thrower, in a field of continually shifting notions concerning the personal styles of Greek sculptors, who are named in our ancient sources, but whose masterpieces rarely, if ever, survive in the original. How the statue of a boy taunting a lizard came to achieve iconic status in the history of art makes an intriguing story, and one that perhaps deserves to be reconsidered in light of all the evidence, some old and some more recent. Two recent events have made a reevaluation of the attribution to Praxiteles and the identification of the statue type timely. One is what you see here, the acquisition in 2004 by the Cleveland Museum of Art of a life-size bronze statue of the so-called Apollo Sauroktonos type, a statue it now believes to be Praxiteles' bronze original. Because we have virtually no originals from the hands of the most famous artists of antiquity, it would be unprecedented for one to survive. Even the famous Hermes with the infant Dionysus, a statue which was found in the very location mentioned by the Roman traveler Pausanias as Olympia, is usually taken now to be a later copy of Praxiteles' original statue. Oops, there's the lizard. The second reason for reexamination is the first ever monographic exhibition devoted to this sculptor, which was held at the Louvre in 2007, and later version was held in Athens. An extensive essay in the exhibition catalog summarizes the scholarship to date, the relevant comparanda, and the issues surrounding this puzzling statue type. The Cleveland bronze was not included in the exhibit, but it is discussed in the catalog. Now we're going to go on a long romp going back to the 18th century. And in what follows, I will impugn the authority of our best source for ancient art, Pliny, his natural history, question an ironclad and largely unquestioned attribution going as far back as Winckelmann in 1760, suggest that the aesthetic attraction of pretty boys was stronger than that of prettified gods, and that the construction of our history of Western art is predicated on homoerotic tastes. In short, there are three problems with the Apollo Sauroktonos, as defined in the current scholarship on Greek sculpture in general, and that of Praxiteles specifically. Namely, its identification, its date, and finally, its attribution. The story begins in 18th century Rome with its mania for collecting gems and cameos. In Rome, there was a rather peculiar gentleman, later called a Prussian sodomite, who was a connoisseur, a collector of gems, a dealer, and a spy. Now, I think I have is this the pointer? No. Well, he's the man there. He made the monocle popular. He popularized, he was the first one to have a monocle. You can see that down in the lower left. And I think what's also interesting about this print, oh, hey. Thank you, Ken Ledford, History Department Chair. Okay, coming to the rescue. This is kind of an interesting view of a statue in his collection. Anyway, Baron von Stosch, he lived in Rome. He finally caught spine, had to move to Florence. Here he is. Here's a nice, more complimentary portrait of him. He was the first to identify the image carved on an ancient intaglio, that's a gem, as a representation of a famous statue described by Pliny in his Natural History. He did so in this book you see on the right, which was published in 1724, a very lavish illustrated volume on ancient gems. The gem in question, which is now lost, was an emerald in a Dutch collection, that of Van der Mark of Haarlem, and the statue was the Apollo Sauroktonos, attributed to the 4th century sculptor Praxiteles. Because Pliny provided, we'll see this in a minute, an uncharacteristically full description of the bronze statue, it was not difficult to make the identification. The gem is not illustrated in this book, but it is mentioned. Now, von Stosch himself, as I said, he was a collector. He had amassed a huge collection of antique, in both the gems themselves and glass paste casts of the originals. In fact, he had to add on to his house in Florence an extra wing and just to house these thousands of gems. Now, these in turn were published. Here's the gem in question, and here's the statue, and you can see the figure standing there and the lizard on the tree, and the quote from Pliny that I'll come to in a minute. So here is, these were published, as I said, by none other than Johann Joachim Winckelmann, otherwise known as the father of art history. His catalog appeared in 1760 and thenceforth served as a model for the classification of ancient carved gems by style and subject matter, and that's his book on the right. Winckelmann's examination of these gems was instrumental in his burgeoning preoccupation with the stylistic development of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman art, much of which was based on what he learned from studying these small gems. And we'll come back to Winckelmann at the end of the lecture. Now, one of the glass pastes in the von Stosch collection depicted this youthful male nude leaning on a tree upon whose trunk an oversized lizard is shown crawling. The boy holds what might be an arrow in his right hand and is in a distinctive pose with his left leg bent and poised directly behind his weight-bearing leg. Winckelmann associated this miniature image with a life-size marble statue representing the same subject in the Borghese collection. That's the statue here on the right, which ended up in the Louvre. Like von Stosch, he identified it on the basis of Pliny's text. Praxiteles made a youthful Apollo waiting for a lizard waiting with an arrow for the lizard who was crawling up towards him, which they call Sauroktonos, or lizard slayer. When compiling the von Stosch catalog, Winckelmann was appointed secretary to Cardinal Alessandro Albani in Rome. This prestigious post brought him into contact with the cardinal's rich collection of antiquities, among which was an under life-size bronze Sauroktonos that you see on the right there, left, discovered on the Aventine in Rome, and the tree here is a modern restoration. So in his 1764 Geschichte der Kunst des Altertums, he could point to 3 ancient versions of the statue, 2 marble ones in the Borghese collection and this bronze one in the Villa Albani. He took the larger and better preserved of the 2 Borghese versions to be Praxiteles' original, in spite of the fact that Pliny lists it in his book on metals, book 34. In 1767, he published this engraving on the right in his Monumenti Antiqui Inediti, where he claimed, quote, it would not be unreasonable to think, end quote, that the Borghese statue was by the Athenian sculptor himself. He referred to the Albani statue, as you see here, as one of the most beautiful figures of bronze that has remained to us from antiquity. No doubt this was part of a strategy to flatter his patron, the cardinal, on whom he depended for his livelihood. Since Winckelmann's, well, let's go back a second, highly influential History of the Art of Antiquity was published, few scholars have doubted the identification of this statue type with the bronze mentioned by Pliny. The number of known replicas and variants now has grown to over 60, all but 2 of which are in marble, many of which are mere fragments. And as we have seen above, the type is known from gems dating from the imperial period. Here are some of them. So it was a common type. It's also represented on coins of Roman date. Here I show you one from Thrace. These were, this was from the time of Antoninus Pius, 2nd century. And there are others, I'll just show you a few more. This one does show the lizard on the tree, as you can see. I think you can just barely make that out there. But others replace the tree with a column, as you see here, with no lizard. And finally, one here from Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, in the Troad, replaces the tree with a column and puts the statue in a temple. One Italian scholar has recently argued that this might have been the original location of the statue, commissioned by the city when it was under Persian rule in the mid-4th century. But without the tree, the statue is not that described by Pliny, and there's no lizard, which is rather important. And where would this, could this, although this might be some kind of Praxiteles type statue, it is definitely not the Sauroktonos. The most recent addition to the large corpus of copies, of course, is the Cleveland bronze. And it's of special interest, as I said, because it's the only life-size version in metal. And Pliny tells us that Praxiteles' original was exceptionally of metal, not the usual medium for his many statues of gods, which were in marble. And although battered, bent, missing most of the arms in the tree, and much restored, it can nevertheless be identified by the Sauroktonos, by the providential survival of a bronze lizard or saura, and by its resemblance, of course, to the marble copies you've already seen. Although the Cleveland statue has not been scientifically published and its provenance is incomplete, if not completely fabricated, like most antiquities bought on the market, it was first presented in a International Congress in 2003 in Bucharest as a Roman copy. And after scientific examination, the Cleveland Museum of Art now makes the rather bold claim that the statue is not only the original by Praxiteles, but that it represents Apollo, not slain, not a lizard, as stated by Pliny, but the python, a monstrous dragon-like creature that lived at Delphi, and that its original context was none other than Delphi. Now, statues don't come with passports. So we have no secure evidence for any of these presumptions. And according to the scientific report on metals, quote, "It is not possible to assign this sculpture to a particular period on the basis of the composition," end quote. So let's now look at these problems one by one. The first one is iconographical. Is a prepubescent youth maliciously killing or toying with a little reptile an appropriate action for the god of archery? He's not only the god of archery, he's the god of light and wisdom and music and also the sun and everything else. And it's interesting to note that long ago, a scholar, Jody Maxim, suggested that this lizard on the tree is not a free-roving lizard, but in fact, he has been caught in a small leash or lassoed, as you see here, by a piece of grass. This is a common game still engaged in by young children on the Greek islands where these lizards are rampant and run around on the walls, and you can catch them with a little piece of string or grass, as you see here. And since lizards move swiftly and are afraid of humans, it makes sense that the reptile is already caught, thus making it easier for it to be struck with an arrow. But if this is the case, then the slain is even less worthy of a hero, much less a god. There are a few comparanda, and I won't go into them, but this is the best one. This is a mosaic from North Africa that shows a young Dionysus dangling a lizard by a leash, but he's a young boy, and there you see it. That's the only parallel we have for it, but it shows that these are clearly playthings of children. And although lizards can sometimes be associated with death because they live in the ground, they're never life-threatening. And in Roman funerary sculpture, they are represented with children, especially the sleeping Eros. I think you can see there's one here, there's one over here. Many of these sleeping cupids have little wall lizards there in the vicinity, and they've usually been interpreted as being protective of the child, the sleeping child. Oops. So the iconography represents an embarrassing situation for scholars who feel they must excuse this less than flattering image of a major Greek deity. Either it is meant to be amusing, which would be unprecedented for an image of a god, Greek god, or it has to be interpreted as an allusion to Apollo's slaying of the great python, which is regularly depicted. The python is a common attribute of Apollo. You can see it here. It's a big snake. The other one here on the Apollo Belvedere. So it is often associated with Apollo. So these scholars equate the term Sauroktonos, which means lizard slayer, with alexikakos, meaning in Greek, averter of evil. The python represents evil. Pliny, in fact, does mention a statue of Apollo shooting the python, serpentum here, referring to it as a snake, with his arrows, an action appropriate to the god. But this lost bronze statue is attributed to the 5th century sculptor Pythagoras of Rhegion. So Pliny, the natural historian, clearly knew the difference between a snake and a lizard. As for the python, which lived here at Delphi, it was considered to be an enormous snake in antiquity. Here we see it encircling the omphalos of Apollo. This is another symbol of Apollo, the navel of the earth. And of course, snakes are legless. And according to ancient representations of the myth, Apollo killed the python with his bow and arrows, as befits the far shooter. That's one of his epithets in Homer. And as a mere toddler, often shown in his mother's arms. Several Attic black figure vases, this is one here, and a later red figure vase, show him in his mother's arms. The bow and arrow may be missing in this painting after the vase. And he's also on a coin from Croton, he has slain the snake. So if we are dealing with the slaying of a puny reptile, and one possibly tethered to a string, then the intention must be humorous, a childhood prank. Childhood pranks on the part of gods and heroes are not the usual subject of classical sculpture. Baby gods and heroes do kill large, threatening serpents, as Heracles does in his crib, down here. Cadmus slays the dragon at Thebes. And Jason slays a dragon here, a snake, in other words, in Colchis. Heroes can be Kentaro, well, I'll just say this in English, centaur slayers. Gods can be titan slayers. But lizard slayer, by comparison, sounds somewhat ludicrous. In fact, it is humorous, not unlike Hellenistic sculptures, popular Hellenistic sculptures like this, the boy strangling the goose. Okay, let's turn to dating. The dating of the Sauroktonos type to the mid-4th century, I think, can also be called into question. It can be argued that the pose and the peculiar hairdo find closer parallels in Hellenistic art. I just bring you back this. This has been argued that this is a snake, but you can clearly see that it has legs. Feet attached to it, even though the head is rather snake-like. Okay. Now for the pose, the hip shot or S-curve pose was certainly pioneered by Praxiteles, as we know from his famous Hermes at Olympia that I mentioned earlier, or his more famous Aphrodite of Cnidos. It is a fairly stable pose with the feet planted apart, with the feet apart and planted firmly on the ground, even though she doesn't have feet, they were on the ground. The Sauroktonos statue, on the other hand, presents an excessively leaning pose. Winckelmann found it so unlike the ideal stance of a god that he claimed Apollo must have been represented in mortal guise, i.e. as a shepherd in the service of King Admetus. Comparing the back view of the Aphrodite with that of the Sauroktonos illustrates this point. The main viewpoint of the Hermes and Aphrodite is frontal, but the Sauroktonos type is not, as the hip pivots to accommodate his action. The oblique position makes it difficult to photograph, and so these shots taken from an angle are more intelligible. The instability of the pose is increased by the position of the feet. The left foot is raised and placed directly behind the right, as you see here. As such, the tilted pose demands a major support for the figure's left arm, both in bronze and marble. And with the exception of the resting satyr, another type attributed to Praxiteles, who stands in mirror image but rests his elbow more convincingly on a tree trunk, this awkward pose was never adopted for other standing figures in later sculpture. Rather, late classical and Hellenistic sculptors chose a more stable pose for leaning figures, namely placing the bent leg crossed over in front of the other. So many scholars have argued that this pose of the Sauroktonos type, like that of the very lounging pothos, longing type, are too advanced, that these poses are too advanced for the mid-4th century and so should be later in the next Hellenistic phase. Another peculiar and almost certainly late feature of this statue is its elaborate hairdo. The youth's long hair radiates from the top of the head, parted in the middle, over the forehead, and is swept up under a headband. Two round nodules, clumps of hair, protrude above the ears. This is a very beautiful pentelic marble version of this type from Greece, which is now in the Benaki Museum in Athens. It's Antonine in date, and it illustrates this hairdo rather well. The same hairdo appears on the head of Hypnos, a figure of sleep that you see here, dated to the Hellenistic period, so 100 or so years later, and to some extent on the Madragone Antinous, which is Hadrianic in date, so Roman. But the most telling feature of the statue is its effeminacy. In his study of Praxiteles, the art historian Georges Perrault wrote, I won't read it in French, but one is tempted to ask if this wasn't influenced by a female model, because certain elements like the roundness of the shoulders and the chest, parts of the body, are those more like women than men. And the head, he says, it's entirely feminine, end quote. In 1767, Winckelmann wrote of the pose. I should go back and show you the pose. Well, We'll come to it in a minute. The young Sauroktonos stands in just this way in 2 marble statues in the Villa Borghese and in a bronze one in the Villa Albani. These probably represent him when he served as a shepherd to King Admetus, as I said. Both the pose and the hairdo are excessively androgynous, and as such find better stylistic links with such Hellenistic statues as the sleeping Aphrodite. It occurred to me that if this statue stood up, it would be in exactly the pose, except for the right arm, of the Apollo Sauroktonos. So feminine is the hairstyle, in fact, that the head was often incorrectly attached in the 18th century to a female body, as in this statue of Aphrodite in the Villa Albani collection. This was a fragment of a head, and they stuck it on this body. And even in more modern times, the Sauroktonos type was thought to be so fetchingly feminine that it could be used for a model of Eve, as in this marble by the late 19th century French sculptor Alexandre Falguière. Because the closest parallel for the hairdo is a Hellenistic statue and the pose is too advanced, I believe, for the 4th century, the mid-4th century date seems unjustifiable. Likewise, the genre subject matter finds its closest parallel in the Hellenistic period in subjects like the boy strangling the goose, and the androgynous nature of the work is arguably post-classical. Now let's turn to the attribution to Pliny by Praxiteles, which is usually never challenged and is considered rock solid. One of my former teachers at Bryn Mawr College, in a footnote, this was Brunhilde Ridgway, great expert on Greek sculpture, noted problems with Pliny's credibility. And she, just before he lists this Apollo Sauroktonos, he talks about the tyrannosides. You can see that here. He's talking about various attributions to Praxiteles, and he says statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, the tyrannosides, which were carried off by Xerxes, king of the Persians, and restored to Athens. Now, we know full well, we have a lot of other documentation, that this group was sculpted by a man named Antenor and was looted by the Persians in 490 BC. So we're talking well before the time, 140 years before Praxiteles. And after the defeat of the Persians, it was brought back by Alexander. So Praxiteles is clearly mistaken in some of his attributions. And I think this could also have been the case with the Apollo Sauroktonos. Now, there's one other ancient reference, only one, to this term Sauroktonos, and it's in a book of epigrams by a Latin poet named Martial. He's talking about small statuettes and paintings that were given at a festival called the Saturnalia. And under the title Sauroktonos Corinthios, he describes a statue thus. He says, "Spare, treacherous child, the lizard which is crawling toward you. It is eager to perish by your hand." Now, he doesn't mention Praxiteles, you notice here, or Apollo. And I think if Martial were aware that this was Apollo, he certainly would have used the identification. And in fact, his use of the term puer actually argues against it being a divinity, as this term, and I thank Professor Knox for helping me with this, is never applied in Latin to the god, with one exception. Horace calls him puer Latoni, which means he's the son of Leto. And as for the term insidious, it is only once used in reference to a god, and that is when Ovid applies it to Eros. So in theory, Martial could be describing not an image of Apollo, but a playful sculpture appropriate as a Saturnalia gift often given to young boys. Now, we don't have to entirely throw out Praxiteles, because there was a long family dynasty of sculptors, starting with Praxiteles' father, Kephisodotos. This is the Praxiteles to whom most of the attributions are given, but he had a son and probably a grandson, Praxiteles II, because often sculptors' children apprenticed with their parents and continued the workshop. So it's entirely possible that there would be a Praxiteles in the 3rd century who could have made this statue. In fact, Pliny lists 55 sculptures by Praxiteles, and a considerable number of these were actually sculptural groups. So many scholars have questioned the validity of this level of output. In fact, Andrew Stewart, a great connoisseur of Greek sculpture and art historian, has written, quote, "The length of this list, far greater than any one man could produce in a lifetime, suggests either the activities of a sizable workshop and or following, or a phenomenon equivalent to that of the proudly displayed Raphael in every self-respecting Italian church, or both." In other words, many works from antiquity that looked Praxitelean could have been misattributed to the mid-4th century artist as opposed to his descendants. And I've often wondered if Pliny went to such great lengths to describe this statue. He doesn't describe any other statue in quite such length, precisely because no one would ever have recognized it as Apollo. So then the question remains as to why this statue, clearly celebrated in antiquity, as we've seen from its frequent copies, its appearance on coins and gems, could be misidentified and misunderstood by later sources. So now we must switch to the Roman context, the context and the popular taste in the early Roman Empire when most of these reproductions were made. Another great scholar of sculpture, Liz Bartman, has cogently argued that there was a decided taste for statues of effeminate young males, or what she calls sexy boys. This was a very important article. And to quote the opening sentence, she says, "Images of youthful males characterized by a soft, just prepubescent physique and a relaxed soigné pose constitute a distinctive sculptural genre popular during Roman times," end quote. Like the Sauroktonos type, these statues lack distinctive musculature and pubic hair. They have sweet girlish faces, modestly looking down. Their hair is curly and flowing. And as such, they represent the ideal of the sexually compliant, beautiful youth, what the Greeks call the eromenos, the beloved. The provenances of most of these Roman sexy boys are private villas and bathing establishments. Known contexts for the Apollo Sauroktonos marble copies likewise are Roman gardens and houses, not temples or sanctuaries. In this Roman context, the lizard could have another significance. The Hadrianic period poet Straton of Sardis composed epigrams collected in a work of pederastic poetry entitled Musa Puerilis. The oldest version I just learned of is in a monastery on Patmos. In several epigrams, the word saura, lizard, is synonymous with, as the Greek dictionary puts it, the membrum virila. Epigram 12:3 describes the stages of masturbation on the part of a young boy. If lizard is a slang word for the penis, particularly of boys, this lends new meaning to the Roman versions of the statue. And in fact, Hans Licht, a German scholar, in a reading which has not been cited in relation to the statue, makes the association of the Greek word for saura and the statue. I don't know if you can read this in Latin or in Greek, but it says that which the hand agitates is called the lizard. Okay, just one of many quotes from the Musa Puerilis. Okay, because the term dine is a Latin metaphor, let's go back to Marshall, for sexual orgasm, and the word digitus often suggests masturbation in epigram, Marshall's expression concerning the lizard who wishes to die, perire, by the hand, digitus, of the youth is fairly explicit. Thus, the youth's titillation of the lizard, perhaps by bobbing it with a string, conveys a sexually charged message to the Roman viewer. Whether the statue held a similar meaning for a Hellenistic Greek is unknown, but given the prevalence of homosexuality in ancient culture, it seems very likely. Now, the sexual connotations of the lizard were definitely known in antiquity, but they were also known since the 15th century. And, whoops. Oh, yeah. I was happy to discover in the Smith Library, in the rare book room, this early edition of Martial, which was published in Venice in 1482, and you can see Sauroktos Corinthius and the quote right there on the text, showing that this was quite commonly read and very popular in Renaissance Italy. And it has been argued that in fact, the famous painting by Caravaggio, Boy Bitten by a Lizard, was inspired by the Sauroktonos type and possibly the epigram of Martial. The painting is generally interpreted as an allegory for pain derived from love. In 1971, the art historian Donald Posner wrote an article about the homoerotic imagery of Caravaggio and pointed out the sensuous, androgynous, and seductive, as suggested by this bare shoulder. Here's the lizard, I don't know if you can see it. Nature of the boy, not unlike the lizard slayer. Another Hellenistic statue involving a boy and an animal, and which recalls the pose and possibly message of the Sauroktonos, is the group of Ganymede and the eagle. Ganymede is the beautiful Trojan prince who was abducted by Zeus and taken to Olympus to be the cupbearer of the gods. So that's Zeus and the guys who love these guys is attacking both boys and women. So here he is an eagle. Note the pose, similar pose, the downward glance, and the homoerotic overtones. This loving group is actually depicted in another form in a fresco, which appeared in the first edition of Winckelmann's Geschichte in 1760. It was supposedly discovered in the ruins of an ancient villa near Rome, and Winckelmann, who went to great lengths to get, this was in a private collection, he went to great lengths to find this because he wanted to illustrate it in his book. He considered it, quote, the most beautiful painting to have emerged from antiquity to the light of our time. End quote. In his letters to friends, he waxed rhapsodic about the newly discovered painting, specifically praising Ganymede as, quote, a handsome and well-formed youth of 18 years, whose head is beautiful beyond all comprehension. I don't know if this is an 18-year-old, but anyway. In the first edition of his History of Art, he wrote of Ganymede, I know of nothing to be compared to his countenance. So aglow is it with sensuous delight that his entire life seems naught but a kiss, end quote. It's the purple prose of Winckelmann. These accolades demonstrate how a connoisseur, as knowledgeable and intelligent as Winckelmann, could be misled by the personal appeal of the subject matter, for this supposedly antique fresco is a forgery, fabricated by the neoclassical artists Anton Meggs and Giovanni Casanova, the brother of the infamous rake. As I said, I would come eventually to Charles Ray. And just this is a kind of a coda. This is an 8-foot stainless steel sculpture painted white, clearly intended to evoke classical marble statues of divinities, which was set up in Venice in 2009 at the Punta della Dogana. He's a California artist, was commissioned by an Italian to do this. It replaced a lamppost, and I guess the Venetians eventually in 2013 wanted the lamppost back. So this statue, which had become much beloved of the boy with the frog, was removed, and I believe it was on display at the Getty. But I think it also demonstrates the playful nature of the boy with the reptile and how it still has resonance today, and also a kind of homoerotic subtext. So we've traveled far from Praxiteles and the Sauroktonos, following the trail through various figures like Caravaggio and Winckelmann, and I think you can see that there's a common thread here. So I present this case, namely the possibility that a later Hellenistic artist named Praxiteles devised an image in the Praxitelean manner, but more exaggerated, of a youth taunting a pet lizard, which at some later point was misidentified as Apollo for reasons unknown, but possibly because of the arrow which might have been in its right hand. Thus, Pliny felt the need to give a detailed description, for no ancient viewer would have recognized this puer as a god. Perhaps because he knew that the original Praxiteles was famous for sculpting Greek gods, he accepted the identification of what was once a Hellenistic genre sculpture as the divinity. Its popularity in Roman times, like that of the resting satyr, is due to the prevailing taste for classicizing statues of beautiful boys. One leaning on a tree could also evoke a pastoral setting, highly appropriate for the garden of a Roman villa. As stunning new statues emerge from the sea and elsewhere, it is tempting to assign them to the actual hand of a famous artist from antiquity, as was recently the case with the Praxitelean, a dancing satyr from Mazzara del Vallo in Sicily, which is also, as you see, represented in the minor arts. Perhaps we should resist this temptation and instead take the opportunity to review the evidence and question the received wisdom dating back to the 18th century, when Northern European gentlemen were first seduced by the sexy statues of classical antiquity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenifer, for that characteristically unprovocative presentation. It's possible that there may be a few ripples when the article appears with these results. There may even be some here in the room. We have two opportunities for questions, here now and then following at a reception in the foyer outside. So if you have any questions, please signify in the traditional manner, and I will come around with the microphone so that you can be heard.
Jenifer, that was marvelous. Thank you. But I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts for us about, I was very struck by the kind of fluid position of the left hand, where he's leaning but not on the hand, which is typically how you lean on something, but rather on the sort of back of the arm. Does that have any significance?
And what's the question?
Just if you have any comments on the...
Well, the arm is actually in different, there are many copies, and the arm isn't always, first of all, this one isn't quite correct because it's usually shown leaning against the tree, not poised on it. This is a copy in, I think it's in Copenhagen, that's set up at the Getty in the garden. And so it's not the same in every single version. In fact, the Louvre version and the Vatican version are different. So we're not quite sure about that arm. And since we don't have it in the original, in an original bronze, we can't be sure exactly where it was. But it's a highly, very, very leaning pose. And I've tried to make the point that that isn't quite the way, say, the known works of Praxiteles, the Aphrodite or the Hermes, are never leaning that far. You could say it's a later work by Praxiteles and more dramatic in that sense, but I still think it's too dramatic for the mid-4th.
Hi, Dr. Neils. Thank you so much for speaking. How does the Cleveland Museum of Art come to acquire the said sculpture in question?
Well, I didn't get into that. There's a long story about it being in a East German garden, and which was opened up after the war. The owner sold it to a dealer, remembers it somehow in his youth as kicking around the garden, but doesn't remember who he sold it to 2 years prior. But I think the museum tried to authenticate this story, but unless you have information independent of the dealer, say a photograph of it in the garden, then it is unprovenanced. So we really don't know where it came from. It was first presented by a Romanian scholar, maybe that some thought that her connection might have suggested it. These copies are found all over, well, mostly Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, copies of Greek sculpture, but and most bronzes, I should say, are found from shipwrecks, because in antiquity, the intrinsic value of the metal meant that most bronze sculpture was melted down for cannon or whatever balls, and that's why we have so few bronzes extant.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting and fascinating. I'm very interested in the lizard-like creature in the Cleveland Museum. You remember that it's asymmetrical legs?
Yeah.
It doesn't look like any lizard.
Well, if you, I don't want to act out a lizard, but their legs, actually their legs when they crawl, they're like this, you know, one's way back and one's way forward. And I think that could be why those things look asymmetrical. There's also a break in the middle of the lizard, which could indicate that maybe those two pieces weren't joined right, or I don't know. But I mean, there's a break there which could lead one to question whether one half is authentic or not, or you know, whatever. But I do know that if you look at lizards on walls, their legs aren't going like this, they're like this, you know. So I think that explains the yeah. And the lizards in the Roman copies, the Roman marble copies, are all slightly different and slightly bigger, fat lizards, such that Andy Stewart thought that it was some kind of poisonous lizard living in the Peloponnese that actually bit you, and in a few months the wound would become inflamed, and so it was an evil thing that had to be killed by Apollo. But
So I thought it was perhaps some kind of symbolism, not a real lizard.
no,
was
it's a
symbolic of
lizard, but it's
something.
clearly not a snake. It's not the
Yes,
python.
no, it's not a snake.
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
established that much anyway. Okay.
Hi, you mentioned that there was an exhibition and publication on the works by Praxiteles, and while the Cleveland Apollo was not included in the exhibition, it was included in the catalog, and I'm just curious what their take on the Cleveland Apollo was.
Well, the entry was written by the museum's curator, so we don't have their take. It was not included in the show because the Greeks objected to having an unprovenanced antiquity in the show. They would not lend their Praxitelean pieces. They have a base signed by Praxiteles, among other things, if this statue were in the show. I think it's unfortunate it wasn't in the show, because it would have given us a chance to see this in conjunction with most of the other copies. But it wasn't, and there is an entry there in French in the catalog, and I don't believe it was included in the Greek catalog, if I recall correctly. Yeah. You probably don't want to read it in Greek anyway, but you know.
Thank you, Doctor. It was a fascinating and interesting presentation. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I also don't want to leave without understanding your thesis. Is it possible for you to make clear whether, in your opinion, there is a valid connection between the bronze across the road and the marble copies, I'll put that as in air quotes, that are at the Louvre and in Manchester and at the Vatican? Just whether there's a connection among those.
There's no doubt that they're all Sauroktonos. I don't believe they're Apollo, but they're all lizard slayers, and they're all of this type. And this is just very common in Greek art, that we depend on Roman copies because we don't have the Greek originals. And so since the 18th century, this game has been going on of reading the name of a statue and then finding something that, like the discus thrower, and then deciding that this one that we have several copies of must be by Myron. I mean, we could be totally wrong. There could be another Discobolus by Myron, but this one is actually fairly well described in an ancient source. But so this matching game has been going on for a long time. And it's all we have. I mean, in antiquity, we don't have signed statues with the artist's name on them and the title and the date or anything like that. So we have to reconstruct the whole history of Greek art based on ancient sources, extant sculptures, gems, coins, statue bases that have signatures, whatever we can get a hold of. By the way, there are many statue bases with the name Praxiteles on it from much later periods. So,
if you'd allow me a follow-up.
Yes, I hope I answered that. I went off, yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. Recently, well, not so recently, there was an exhibition at the museum with two of the marbles and the Cleveland bronze. And to the uneducated my eye, they looked extremely similar, as if they were, if not copies of each other, from a common source or something like that. And I think that's really what I'm asking is whether, in your professional, well-educated opinion, that was still there the way that my uneducated eye saw it, or whether that opportunity, I don't know if you had the opportunity to see it.
Very close. We can assume, because bronze has much greater tensile strength than marble, that you didn't need the struts in the marble, in the bronze. The tree could have been more slender. There are differences often slight differences between a bronze casting and a carving. They're very different techniques, but I would agree, yes, they're all the same Sauroktonos type.
I think we'll make that the last question for round one. Round two, we'll continue outside the doors, but before I invite you to sample some of the refreshments and conversation, please join me in thanking our distinguished speaker one more time.